Welcome to episode 293 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Tim Gallagher, who served in the FBI for 22 years. In this episode, he reviews his investigation of a multi-state check counterfeiting ring that operated out of Northeast Ohio. Banks and businesses were hit with fake payroll checks and bogus personal checks, which caused hundreds of thousands of dollars of check fraud losses. Tim teamed up with a Secret Service agent and detectives from state and local police agencies to identify and convict the ringleaders. The case also resulted in the recovery of the remains of a cooperating witness suspected of being murdered to stop him from testifying. At the time of the investigation, Tim was assigned to the Cleveland Division in a 7-agent resident agency in Canton, Ohio, where he worked a variety of violations. Later in his FBI career, Tim served as a supervisor in Kansas City, Missouri, and then led various high-profile and criminal cyber investigations as an assistant special agent in charge, and then special agent in charge at the Washington field office. During this time period, he also held several senior management positions at FBI headquarters, to include Chief of the Financial Crimes Section, Chief of Cyber Outreach and Strategic Initiatives, and Deputy Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigative Division. His last bureau assignment was as the special agent in charge of the FBI's Newark Division, where he led 800 professionals in the New Jersey office in their efforts to bolster national security and combat crime and cyber threats. Since his retirement, Tim has appeared on CNN, NBC News, Fox News, NPR, and in The Washington Post, among other outlets, to comment on matters ranging from developing cybercrime and emerging trends in artificial intelligence to multifaceted law enforcement matters. Currently, Tim is a managing director of digital investigations and cyber defense and chief security officer of Nardello and Company. Now, before we get to the case review, I have something short, sweet, and sincere that I have to say to you. Thank you for supporting my mission and for supporting the FBI. That's it. That's all I have to say. I just wanted to make sure that you knew how much I appreciate you and how much I love sharing FBI stories. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can join my reader team, which is all about crime fiction, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my books. And I have to say it one more time. Thank you for the support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Tim Gallagher. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Jerry, how are you?
I'm doing great. I worked economic crime most of my career, and the case that we're going to talk about today is a counterfeit check fraud case. It is way different than any case that I ever worked because yours involves homicides, and usually the white-collar crime cases don't have any type of violent crimes. I'm real excited for you to share this case with everyone today.
Looking forward to it, Jerry.
Where do you want to start?
I'd start back in 1996. I was a brand new agent assigned to the Canton resident agency out of the Cleveland Division. It was about 7 agents, and having a financial background, anything involving a bank, whether it was bank fraud or bank robbery, usually found my desk. Usually was assigned to me by my supervisor. During that time, I belonged to a bankers working group as well, which was a great group of about 15 individuals. We had bankers, we had forgery detectives, and we had federal agents like myself. We would sit down a couple times a month and walk through what kind of fraud schemes we were seeing back then.
I know usually when I hear counterfeit, I think is Secret Service. So I take it there were Secret Service agents maybe also in that group?
Absolutely. This case, which first came to us in 1999, was jointly worked by myself and a Secret Service agent. We worked together day and night on this case. We were equal partners the whole way.
And that's one of the things I like about this show is we can bust that myth, that stereotype of the FBI not working well with others and not getting along with other three-letter agencies. We can debunk that. And by just showing cases that we've worked together, like you said, this was a whole working group. So in addition to the Secret Service agent, I take it that other members of the group were also involved in this case. Who else was in that group?
The Canton Police Department, the Akron Police Department, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And as you'll see later on in the case, we also relied heavily upon our friends at the U.S. Marshal Service and the U.S. Probation Service.
This is going to be a great case to show that the FBI works well with our law enforcement partners. Tell us more.
Back in 1999, in one of our weekly meetings, the bankers started bringing up that there was a spike in the amount of counterfeit checks which were being hit in the area. Obviously, the first question that I asked, is it payroll checks? Are they corporate checks? Or are they personal checks? Just trying to get a handle on, like, where do we start here? And the answer was all of the above. It wasn't just one type of check. All kinds of personal checks were being counterfeited, resulting in people, individuals, having their bank accounts drained. And when they write legitimate checks, those checks were bouncing. The same things were happening to corporations in the area. Their payroll checks would bounce because they only put a certain amount of payroll into that account to match the amount of checks that they wrote. And when the counterfeit payroll checks hit, that caused checks to be returned as well. And it really upended the financial system among businesses and individuals alike in that area back in this time frame. I worked this case jointly with my local colleagues, but most importantly with my colleague from the Secret Service. As an aside, he and I worked together so much that he ended up marrying my next door neighbor because he was at my house all the time. We worked this thing, as I said, day and night. So what we were doing at the beginning is looking at these checks and mapping them out. What kind of commonality can we find? Was there a common point of compromise, a bank, a business, a person, somewhere that we knew that these accounts were being compromised? So we mapped everything out. We got together with our local PD comrades and we said, hey, look, if you see anything, call us right away and we'll get right on it, as well as the banker. So we started bringing information real time. One of the first things you're doing, obviously, is like going out to interview the names on the checks that came back counterfeit. And a lot of them were stolen identities. So that turned into an investigative dead end. When you go out and interview someone and they say, hey, my purse got stolen or some other compromise, my mail had gotten stolen back then, that was the type of thing. And even that they had gotten hacked, that was a dead end because they were a victim as well. However, we did develop an interesting piece of information in the course of all these interviews that some factory workers were being paid $100 cash to rent their paper paychecks. So if they were going to cash their paycheck on lunch on a payday, they're being approached by individuals who said, hey, we'll give you $100 if you give us your check and then we'll give it back to you, which they thought was kind of weird, but that was information that we developed. In addition, some of them were being paid to rent or to buy their uniforms from some of the factories there. We found out was that these checks were being counterfeited and then the original given back to the worker. Then the person who was actually cashing the check would put on the uniform shirt to kind of go along with, hey, look, this is from this factory down the street and they have a shirt that this would in fact make it look like they actually work there. One of the individuals that we developed as a suspect in the renting the checks was an individual named Daniel Ideen. He had a unique appearance in that he was about 6'7" and weighed over 350 pounds. He had just returned to the area after serving 2 years in federal prison for counterfeiting checks in Columbia, South Carolina in another FBI case. So we knew that he had been released. He had been arrested a couple of years prior with an individual named Lonnie Thompson, who was a prolific forger with about a 2-decade criminal history to his name. The two of them had been released. They were Akron natives, and an individual who met the description of Daniel Ideen had been seen paying for a payroll check. So obviously this is a solid lead for us to pursue, but we needed a lot more. Like most criminals, Ideen and Thompson learned from their lessons of their past arrests and convictions. So if you get caught, you go to prison, you learn from it. And they were able to change their techniques and their procedures to insulate themselves and the criminal operation from getting caught.
So instead of learning not to do the crime, they just learned how to do the crime better.
Absolutely. They utilized their knowledge and their skills to further a criminal enterprise. Our theory at this point was that as the way to insulate themselves, they recruited a small army of runners, people who were recruited into the scheme to go into banks, to steal bank information sometimes from a business, sometimes even to steal from bank employees, and then to actually cash the checks. They also had recruited someone I would call a cyber ninja, someone who could manipulate the checks and create fraudulent checks that looked exactly like the real ones. And then the largest cut of the proceeds would go back to Lonnie Thompson and Daniel Ideen, and the people who were the runners would get a small amount and they'd be on their way. Working with the local police, as some of these runners were arrested for passing the checks, they would get calls. The police would say, hey, we just made an arrest. Would you like to go interview this individual in the jailhouse? So myself and my Secret Service colleague, Keith Verzi, Verzi, would go to the county lockup or the city jail, and we would sit down and talk to them and say, look, we know you're part of a scheme. It's a larger scheme. You're a little fish. Help us out here. We can work with the local prosecutor on your charges. If you can give us some intelligence as to who sent you in here, who's the one actually making money on this. But as you well know, Jerry, from work in economic crime, it was only a small amount of money these individuals were caught with. They were only looking at 0 to 6 months in prison if they were to be prosecuted federally, and the chance of them being prosecuted federally on a small charge like that probably would not happen. So they refused to cooperate, probably under threat of bodily harm from the ringleaders. They took their convictions and kept their mouths shut. We weren't able to really flip any of these folks and work our way up the line. But as I said before, we had this extensive network in place among our state, local, and federal law enforcement colleagues, as well as the banks. It seemed like every law enforcement interaction that involved a counterfeit check came to us. Detectives from different cities would call us up and say they had someone in custody. One night, we even had to call a local police department, made a vehicle stop at a parking lot in a bank. And of course, these things always happen on a Friday night, as I'm sure you can remember that, Jerry. This one happened on a 3-day weekend because in a check fraud scheme, that gives them an extra day before it comes back as counterfeit and gives them an opportunity to flee. They're usually from out of state, the people who are making the deposits or cashing the checks. In this situation, an alert teller noticed it immediately, called the police, who then called us. Went in, we did an interview. I brought my files with me, my surveillance photographs, and I was able to, that night, tie this suspect to $25,000 in losses at different banks that went back a couple of months. This is a little bit towards the edge of what you would take in a federal case, $25,000, but we had an aggressive U.S. Attorney's Office based in Cleveland, and they were looking for that break. They let me swear out a warrant and bring this suspect into court on a federal forgery warrant.
Let me ask you a question. For this one individual, it was about $25,000, but he was a part of this whole group with Thompson and Ideen. How much were the losses so far while you're working this case altogether?
At this point, losses are well over $500,000 that have been impacting the area as victims came forward, whether they be corporations or individuals. And this suspect right here wouldn't even give us what her name was. She just wouldn't cooperate at all. We ran her prints. They came back with a significant criminal history. We were able to get her detained. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, I was able to find $150,000 in fraud through working with my bank contacts, use of surveillance films, using the FBI and the Secret Service network. She ended up getting 21 months in prison, but as I said, she did not cooperate.
Was that because she knew that she was looking at significant time because of her priors, or was she afraid? Because we'll be getting into reasons for her to have been afraid.
I really believe that she did not cooperate for fear of her personal safety. That's why she decided, I'll do my 21 months in prison, but I don't want to endanger myself. She took her felony and went away for 21 months in federal prison. Another interesting lead that came in, this time through the Secret Service, was to an Ohio State trooper who called the service. He had just made an arrest at a rest stop off of I-90 outside of Cleveland. The subject was sleeping in his stolen car. So the alert trooper tags this car. It comes back stolen out of Connecticut. He does a search incident to arrest. He finds a whole stack of counterfeit checks, which are blank, which is interesting. They're counterfeit cashier checks. So they weren't drawn upon a business. They weren't drawn upon an individual's name. They were counterfeit cashier checks that were drawn upon a bank. At this point, they were all blank. The suspect in this car also had several diamond rings in a small bag. It was really a curious fact pattern. So we called up the AUSA and we said, look, here's what we got. We have blank counterfeit checks, so we don't know if there's a loss here. We have a stolen car. We have a bunch of rings, and we have several fake identification cards that this person has on them. You loved working with assistant U.S. attorneys like this. He told him, here's what I need you to do, Tim. I need you to swear out a warrant for interstate transportation of a stolen motor vehicle. Car had been stolen out of Connecticut. This offense I had never sworn out an affidavit before, as well as another charge, having more than 5 fake identifications on you, which is another one that I realized was a federal offense.
Yeah, I never heard of that either. Is there like a limit? You can only have one and you have 5?
Yeah, it's really interesting the way they arrive at these numbers, but it was on the books. And we looked it up, put it in the warrant with the agreement between myself, the Secret Service, and the AUSA. Like, let's get this individual held, get him in federal custody, get him held, and then find out there'll be counterfeit cashier checks that'll come back bad in the next week or so. And of course, that's exactly what happened, where he had gotten on Craigslist and he identified individuals in the area who were looking to sell jewelry. And he would say, hey, I have a cashier's check. I don't have cash. Is a cashier's check okay with you? Of course, most people take a cashier's check drawn upon a bank that they had all heard of. He would write out the cashier's check, which unbeknownst to the victim was counterfeit. He'd take the ring in return and he would be on his way, thinking that after he had spent about 3 or 4 days in Ohio, he would next probably keep driving west and moving to Michigan. Ultimately, his undoing was the fact that he was in a stolen car. We were able to get this individual to plead guilty. And honestly, this one wasn't connected, but it was just the heightened awareness that we had among our law enforcement colleagues was able to bring this person in, and he got 5 years in prison.
Oh, so this was not connected to your Thompson and Ideen case?
No. To give you an idea of, once you put the word out there, here's what we're looking for. We had police officers calling this up. We had bankers calling this up, and this is unconnected. It kind of fit the profile, but it wasn't connected. And I have one last one that I'll add here that honestly, this one turned out not to be connected at all. At first, we thought it was, but it is a good side story. And this one of my colleagues in the RA who worked drug trafficking had an informant come into him and said that there were 2 drug traffickers who came down from Detroit into the area for a couple of days. They were looking for her help. She figured it was to execute a drug deal. So she put on a wire for us to assist in what we thought was going to be the delivery of a couple of kilos of cocaine. And it turned out that they were looking to deliver and cash several counterfeit checks that were worth $8,000 a piece. My colleague called me and he said, would you take this and work it with me? So I said, absolutely. We did it. We did the deal. We were able to make the arrest in the bank parking lot. And they were hoping that it would roll up to Thompson and Ideen. We interviewed the subjects, and it turns out that they were drug traffickers from Detroit who had served time for drug trafficking before, but they had heard the sentencing guidelines, how long you go to prison for financial crimes, was a lot lower than drug trafficking. So they decided they were going to try their luck at check counterfeiting instead of drug trafficking. And their first shot at it, they ended up getting arrested and ended up going back to prison, this time for the financial crime.
There's a theme here that crime doesn't pay, but they don't seem to be getting it. I had to ask you this, and I know this case took place in 1999, but counterfeit checks, it seems like something that would be easy to do as opposed to counterfeiting actual currency and cash. But I didn't hear a lot about it back then when I was doing this type of work, and I certainly don't hear about it now. Could you talk a little bit more about counterfeit checks and how prevalent this type of crime is?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in the 90s, this is at the front age of cybercrime. There were check designing programs and check making programs that you could actually do from a desktop computer. And this is the advent of these programs was that you would be able to manufacture your own checks. So all you had to do was enter in your bank account information and your routing information at the bottom of the check and create your own checks. Obviously, the fraudsters got onto this thinking, wait a minute, why am I going to enter my own bank account information, the routing information of my bank, if I could enter someone else's information at the bottom of the check and it'll drain the money out of their account? So they create these checks. They got corporate logos from the actual checks themselves, like I talked about, the renting the checks. And they were able to put together a check that looked just like the check that would have been sent out by that company or by that individual. They would steal the bank information, put them at the bottom of the check, and then they were able to negotiate them at local banks. You don't hear as much about this anymore, obviously, because banks have started putting in more security features onto the checks in order to combat this. And so probably around 2001, 2002, we were starting to see more and more security features put into the paperwork on the actual checks, which started to thwart this, as well as some other security measures that were taken by financial institutions that I'm not going to get into because they work really well and they were able to defeat the adversaries of the banks and the financial system and law enforcement.
Oh, that's pretty fascinating because, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, this sounds easy to do. Why aren't we hearing more and more about it? But your explanation really tells us why anybody listening to this episode should not go out and try it.
Absolutely not. At the time, it was easy to do. And like anything else, the bad guys sometimes make it a jump, but law enforcement and our team is able to get ahead of it and put stops in place to mitigate the losses associated with this. So in the summer of 1999, we had an odd break in the case. One of our banker contacts gave us a counterfeit payroll check that had the name of Daniel Ideen as the payee. I spoke before about Thompson and Ideen insulating themselves from getting caught through the use of runners, through the use of stolen identification, stolen bank account information. It seemed really unlikely that Daniel Ideen would actually put his name on a check. And further, the check itself had a thumbprint on it, an ink thumbprint. It had been cashed in a non-bank check cashing place. Back then, it was not unusual for the check cashing place to make you put an inked thumbprint right in the middle of the check. They had a little ink pad right there on their countertop. So this check was not for a lot of money, maybe about $500, because it was made to look like it was a payroll check. And it had an inked thumbprint on it. Of course, we ran the thumbprints to see who it would come back to, at which point we would actually go interview that individual. We did not think at all that it would be Daniel Ideen. We ran the print, and sure enough, it came back to Daniel Ideen. He had put his name on a check, and he had inked it, and he had cashed it. So the AUSA we were working with gave us the authorization to go swear to warrant for 1 count of bank fraud. We talked before, this is a very small check, but he was one of the ringleaders, and this was where he had tripped up. And of course, we had no idea where Daniel was, but we would put this warrant in the system and then wait till he showed up somewhere else and got picked up by local law enforcement or by other federal law enforcement if we're able to develop a lead on where he was located.
Any idea why, after being so cautious, that he did this?
Yes, we asked him about it when we had him in custody later, and he said that he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs. He did not do his tasking that day, which was to recruit people to do that, and he just needed some money. So he figured that he could get away with it because it was like a really low dollar amount, but this really ended up being his undoing. The next lead that we got in this case came in from the Secret Service, and you talked before about counterfeit checks and counterfeit money. This one involved counterfeit currency, counterfeit $20 bills, which the Secret Service will tell you is the most counterfeited note out there. The interesting piece about this was that the runners who were involved in them were from the same neighborhood where the runners had been originating from in the Thompson and Ideen case. So obviously we saw probably what was going to be a solid connection. Secret Service did a buy-bust of the seller, the same way the FBI would put together a deal in a drug trafficking case or any other type of case. They did a buy-bust. They made an arrest of an individual named Keith Marsh. Following the arrest, I went in with them. We searched the house. We had a search warrant as well as a seizure warrant to tow away a fraudulently obtained Porsche that he had obtained with fraudulent proceeds. And then I showed up with my portable case file, which had surveillance pictures in it, all kinds of checks organized by where they were cashed, surveillance films from the different cashing operations. Never knowing when I'd get called out, I would just have it with me. And when I get a chance to sit down, I would confront the suspect, which is what I did here with myself and my Secret Service colleague. I'm sure you'll remember this. Sometimes when people are caught, they are cooperative. And Marsh was extremely cooperative. I laid out a series of counterfeit checks as well as identity crimes, which he had been involved in, to include counterfeit checks, another car that he obtained with stolen identity. But the funny part was there were 2 checks, not a whole lot of money, total about $12,000, which I was convinced he had cashed. He told me it wasn't him, but it was one of his neighbors was the actual perpetrator. And when he gave me the individual's name, I was like, I know that guy. One of my colleagues on the squad put that guy in prison for insurance fraud. So I went out to prison to interview this guy, hoping to get further information out of him and a further break in the case. And he wouldn't cooperate at all. We read him his rights. He was in a federal correctional facility outside of Pittsburgh. We talked to him and he would not give us any further information to help us get up the line. We went back to Keith Marsh. We gave him our business cards. He was like, hey, I really appreciate you helping us out here. He was out on bond at this point. And we said, here are our cards. We'll be in touch. And he said he was thinking he would cooperate. He's been cooperative already. That's why we were okay with him getting bond and him being out. As I'm sure you remember from your days, when people cooperate, you get them out on bond and they work with you. That was what we thought was going to be the case here. 2 or 3 days later, I received a call early in the morning on my Nextel phone, which I'm sure you remember as well. It was one of my colleagues from the local Canton Police Department who I work counterfeit and financial crimes with. And he told me that Keith Marsh had been murdered, that he was found dead in his house. Next to his body was the Secret Service agent's business card that had blood spatter on it. He asked me if I had given him my card as well. And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, it's not here. Obviously, the wheels start turning. Like, he left one card, and did they take the other? And where is this going to go from here? Could this be the bad guys looking to get back at law enforcement at this point? So I got together with the Canton Police Department. They said, look, we need to know who you think might want this guy dead. Obviously, we looked through some of the names that he gave us at the point he was cooperating. And suspect number 1 would be the person who was in prison that we had talked to who wouldn't cooperate. So we drove back out there. We worked with the Bureau of Prisons to listen to all of his phone calls over the next couple of days, see who he reached out for, see what he said, see was there anything there in code that could have been connected to this. As you know, when you go into a jail or a prison, you lock up your phone, you lock up your pager, you lock up your gun, and you're unreachable. So we were in the prison for quite some time. When we came out, we received a call back from the detective who was working the case. He said that he was able to get the victim, Keith Marsh, get his son to confess that he had actually killed his father. And he had killed him for the reason that the dad had not shared the proceeds of his criminal deeds with the son who had been involved all along as well. So this is the message is sent here. Even though this is white collar crime, these are very dangerous criminals. Whether they're all connected or not, at this point, we don't know, but this is what we're looking at. As someone cooperated, ended up dead, definitely something to be looked out to in the future as we worked our case.
When you see the card of the Secret Service agent there at the crime scene with blood on it, was that done intentionally to make it look like it was retaliation because he had cooperated? Was the son trying to throw you off? Because it sounds like it was just the murder was because of greed. He just didn't get any of the money.
Yeah, you're right on the money, Jerry. And having been a member of the FBI's evidence response team, I've walked into my share of homicide scenes and looked at what is the crime scene telling you. This one, you're looking at what is this telling us? We see the Secret Service agent's card. Is this a message being sent? And the fact that my card was not there and that was something else. You're looking at a crime scene, what's left behind and what was taken with the murder. What did the murderer take with them when they left the scene? Although that's the way I was thinking about it initially. Was there a message being sent here? It was just a crime of greed. The victim, in this case, probably had lost my card, or maybe it was in his wallet, but I didn't take the time to go through that with the local police as I was headed to the prison to do the interview. Getting back to Daniel Ideen and Lonnie Thompson, eventually our warrant for Daniel Ideen panned out.
In the case of Marsh, however, he was tied in to Daniel Ideen and Thompson.
They knew each other, but I believe they were freelancing. I never really was able to determine to make that link solidly, but as the evidence would indicate, because of the neighborhood, they knew each other and everything that from my investigation, they knew each other, but I was not able to link the two organizations together.
So this is almost like the investigation that keeps on giving. You're finding all of these unconnected but similar cases that are not necessarily the same group. But it seems like everybody knows that at this time anyway, counterfeiting checks is kind of the thing to do.
They were definitely sharing intelligence as to what works and what doesn't work. You could see it as people got arrested and they started changing their tactics. So they're definitely sharing information. But as far as all being connected and sharing criminal proceeds among these different organizations, I think at the end, we may have dismantled maybe 3 different organizations. However, Daniel Ideen and Lonnie Thompson were the top targets for us. Eventually, our warrant for Daniel Ideen panned out. He was arrested by the Prince William County Police Department in Woodbridge, Virginia, with a FedEx envelope full of counterfeit checks drawn upon the bank account of a local construction company. This fits the MO, fits the TTPs. Get a local construction company or a local factory and counterfeit their checks, then use people to go into the banks and cash the checks.
I have to admit, I don't know what TTP, what's that?
Tactics, techniques, and procedures. Their MO. Daniel was in the parking lot when one of the runners got arrested. He was picked up by the alert detective, who then ran him through the NCIC system, the National Crime Information Computer, and he got a hit, federal warrant with my phone number on it. So they called me, and I had the FBI Washington field office roll out and take Daniel Ideen into custody. This is where our partnerships, again, really paid off big time. I talked before about working with Secret Service, U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Here was the U.S. Marshal Service. We work with U.S. Marshals all the time. I was in a resident agency that had 7 agents assigned to it. We worked with our colleagues in law enforcement all the time. If you needed to go out and make an arrest, it didn't matter what your badge said. You were a federal agent. Let's go out and get the bad guys together. So I had several friends in the U.S. Marshal Service. Working with the U.S. Marshal Service, they were responsible for transporting Daniel Ideen from outside of Washington, D.C. up to Cleveland, Ohio to make his initial appearance on our warrant. So the marshal told us, he said, look, we're going to fly him in Sunday night, the night before. We'll probably get him in around 5 or 6 o'clock on that Sunday night, and we'll transport him to federal court the next day. Myself and the Secret Service agent see this as a golden opportunity to go interview Daniel. We drove up to the jail where the U.S. Marshals were holding him on a Sunday night. We sat down with him. We introduced ourselves. He said, I'm aware of you too. I know you've been looking for me. I know that you've been to my mother's house a couple of times and you've been very nice to her, which of course we were. Why would we not be nice to his mother? But that just goes to show you, it's all about building rapport. No matter what you're looking for this person for, you're looking to develop rapport and get to the truth here. He said, you were very nice to my mother, and we read him his rights, and he confessed to absolutely everything. He gave us everything we were looking for. He identified what they had been doing. We showed him surveillance films. We asked him, like, who should we talk to that would be the next best person who's on the outside who may be able to cooperate? And he gave us the name of an individual named Gerald Sykes. He said, Gerald lives in Akron, Ohio. He showed us a couple of surveillance pictures. He said, that's him here, that's him here. So he's giving us good evidence to put in front of Gerald. He said, if you go to Gerald and show him these pictures, he's going to cooperate. He was never really on board with this, so he will flip at this point.
You got your man. When you were starting this case, you were looking for Daniel Ideen. You have him now. He's confessed. Why are you now looking for others?
Well, although Daniel was one of the top individuals in this scheme, Lonnie Thompson was the brains behind the whole operation. Lonnie was the one that we were really looking for. Daniel obviously was a main target, but when you look at the fact that Daniel at some point actually put his name on a check himself, he wasn't the ringleader of this operation because that would never be done. Lonnie Thompson was the one we were looking for, and Daniel was his lieutenant, but we needed to keep working our way up the chain to get to Lonnie. Following up on the information that was given to us by Daniel, we went to Gerald Sykes' house in Akron. We talked to his mother at length once again, just like we did with Daniel. She advised he wasn't there. We left our cards. We came back a couple weeks later, and there was Gerald. He said, yeah, his mother had told him that we were there. And he said, I really knew that this whole scheme was going to come crashing down, and I didn't think this was a good idea. He decided he was going to lay out the whole thing out for us. He told us who they had recruited in businesses and banks to steal account information. And this is like where we really got the logistics of how this worked. We knew about the check renting scheme that I talked about before, but they had also recruited individuals who worked at stores that actually took checks. This is back before everyone used credit cards and debit cards to pay for things. And there were actually stores where people would write checks. And they had recruited people at these stores who would take the checks out of the night deposit before they went to the bank and photocopy them, get all the information off the check to include the bank account and the routing information. And then they would put it back into the night drop bag and they would put it into the bank. It all bounced out. Nothing had been stolen, but the information had been stolen. And that's the information that was then utilized to make some of the counterfeit checks, which emptied out individual customers' account information. He also told us they had recruited co-conspirators that were working in banks to grab account information, sometimes in paper format. Sometimes they would go into interior shred bins where documents had been thrown, whether that be credit reports, bank statements, things that were on their way to being shredded, steal that, and they were able to give that to the ring as well, and then utilize that to create fake identities, to get fake driver's licenses with the bank information to actually get checks. He also showed us where they rented computers from. This was an interesting point. We thought that they had hired some computer whizzes into the group or recruited them into the group to create the counterfeit checks, that they would be using their computers, and that we would ultimately hit a house and we would find several computers that were tied to the ring. And we come to find out that they were renting computers from a local computer rental place. And the idea behind that was, he said, we get it. We create all the checks. We do what we need to do. We manipulate the data, create fake IDs, and then we turn the computer back in. When we went to the computer stores where they were being rented from, we found out that they were wiping the hard drives as soon as they came back in. And that's why this ring was doing that. They rented them. They knew for sure that the computer rental place would wipe the computers as they were turned back in. Remember from your days in the FBI, we're always like, well, we can always recover what's been wiped off the hard drive, but there was no connectivity as to what computer to tie this individual to. So that ultimately ended up being a dead end. And as far as their TTPs went, this was actually kind of effective. To utilize rental computers, it really did insulate them because it didn't leave the chance out there that someone was going to get caught with a computer, which would have the whole scheme at this point approaching $1 million in fraud all on the same computer. It would have been different rental computers that were untraceable at that point.
It's pretty smart on their part.
It was. As I said before, they learned when they went to prison, and I don't know if someone told them when they were in prison, here's a good way to do it next time, but that's what they were doing. Gerald was the link. Gerald told us all that information, and he said it all goes back to Lonnie Thompson. He's the one who's getting all the money, all gets fed back up to him. Sure, I'm willing to testify. But at this point, we need to get Thompson into custody, but we don't have enough to put the whole indictment together yet, because all we really have is the word of Gerald and Daniel, and we need to develop more documentary evidence to put together this indictment where we will be able to put Lonnie Thompson away for a long time. So we did, once again, teamwork. Went to our colleagues at the U.S. Probation Service. We said, here's what we got. We know that Lonnie Thompson is still on federal probation from his arrest in South Carolina. But the probation officer said, sure, we'll put together a warrant for a violation of probation. The condition of his release was that he not associate with known felons, and then obviously he not commit crimes against the U.S. banking system. So that we were able to put a federal warrant in the system at that point for Lonnie Thompson for violation of probation. Then as we're putting our case together over the next couple of months, trying to get that indictment in place that will put him away, hopefully, for a long time, I was working at the FBI office in Canton, Ohio on New Year's Eve. We all remember 1999, we had Y2K, where we were afraid that all kinds of computer issues would come crashing down as the clock struck midnight. And then we went from 1999 to 2000. So I was sitting in the office working on putting this case together. And as we all know, nothing happened. It turned out to be a non-event. but it was a great opportunity for me to work in a very quiet office on putting together hopefully would have been the big indictment against Lonnie Thompson. As I got off of work that morning, the switchboard in Cleveland called me up and they patched through a call. And if you remember, this is before it was common for people to have the cell phone numbers of law enforcement, but she called the office. They patched her through to my phone. Gerald Sykes' mother had asked if we had arrested Gerald Sykes and not told anyone where we had put him. I said, no. I said, your son has never been arrested. He was cooperative with us. Please keep me posted. We have not seen him in a couple of weeks as well. As we were continuing to look for Gerald to get further information and putting our cases together on the check counterfeiting ring, I received a call from the Akron PD in March of 2000. They told me that Lonnie Thompson had been arrested. He had been picked up outside of Cleveland, outside of a bank, just like everyone else had been in this case. They ran him. They saw that he was wanted. The federal warrant was in the system for the probation violation. Lonnie Thompson said to the detective, if you can make one phone call for me, get a hold of the FBI and see if they're willing to drop the probation violation if I can help solve a murder in Akron, Ohio. When I heard this information, I said to the detectives, don't make a deal at all about anything. I got a pretty good idea who the murderer is going to be, and I have a pretty good idea that he's involved in it. Just sit tight. I'm on my way. Secret Service agent, myself, ran up to the jail in Akron, Ohio, where Lonnie Thompson had been transferred to. He told us, he said, sure. He's like, I could tell you where the body of Gerald Sykes is. He described what he would be wearing and that he would be bound in duct tape and that he had been killed by someone else, but Thompson was there and Thompson was aware that Sykes was a witness against him, but denied any involvement at all, said that he was there.
That doesn't make any sense. That he's going to give up his body and tell you about it, try to make a deal on something that is quite obvious that he was involved in. Why else was this guy killed except for the fact that he was providing information, was a witness, was willing to testify against Lonnie Thompson? But he's going to tell you, want to get credit for telling you about the murder.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit it on the head. Thompson advised that he knew Sykes was a witness against him, but he said that the murder was a result of a drug deal gone bad and that he really had nothing to do with it. So he gave us the location. He gave us an address. And being a member of the FBI's evidence response team, I was trained in this type of evidence recovery, here being the recovery of a deceased victim. We called out the FBI Cleveland evidence response team to include a cadaver sniffing dog. We ran the dog through the backyard. The dog indicated on a certain area and then began to scratch into the dirt. That dog handler told me that's obviously him trying to make the smell stronger. He smells it. That's his indicator that as he digs, he's trying to confirm that that's exactly what it is. At that point, we backed the dog out. FBI Cleveland evidence response team and the Akron Police Department, Secret Service, we all worked together to exhume was the body of Gerald Sykes, 6 feet underground, dressed exactly as Lonnie Thompson explained that he would be. Very detailed explanation of how he would look. It wasn't just something that Gerald usually wears this type of clothing, or this was the way he was dressed and he was covered in duct tape. So we had a motive and we know that Lonnie had the opportunity, but we needed to prove the murder here. The Akron Police Department obviously has jurisdiction in this matter. It's a homicide and it's within their city, but they deferred to us. They said this is a federal witness in a federal investigation. So go ahead and take the case.
Could you explain that a little bit more? Because my understanding from what you're telling me, it's not actually the murder investigation that is the federal violation, but the witness retaliation?
That's correct. A lot of violations investigated by the FBI. There's an analog in the state system. So we were working bank fraud. There was forgery on the books in the state of Ohio. Here, the local charge would have been homicide. In the federal statute book, it would have been obstruction of justice. Murder of a federal witness is its own statute. So we would open up a case based upon murder of a federal witness and pursue it federally under that statute. The advantage we had at this point was that Thompson was locked up in federal prison for 1 year on the probation violation. We were able to get him before a judge based upon the probation violation. We have 1 year to build our case now. 1 year to build a bank fraud case, 1 year to build a killing of federal witness case. However, the evidence really didn't help us out. On TV, you see DNA, fingerprints, hair. These are all things as an evidence response team responder I was looking for. We sent absolutely everything to the DNA lab, and we weren't able to come up with anything linking Lonnie Thompson, the actual murder of Gerald Sykes, and that we would be able to bring into court and introduce in a killing a federal witness case. As one of the prosecutors in the case called it, this is like year 2000, this is 23 years ago, she called it the CSI effect. where when people watch CSI, and these are going to be people in our jury pool, they see, hey, there's DNA, there's hair. That links it back to the subject. They're going to want to see that.
What about the circumstantial evidence that you always hear about? I mean, here is a person that was going to testify against Lonnie Thompson. Lonnie Thompson was there. Isn't that enough?
It could be. But the risk here is that if we go to trial and he gets acquitted because we don't have enough evidence yet, he'll never be charged on that again. You only get one bite at the apple. And if we brought him into court at that point without having solid physical evidence, our fear was that the jury pool would, in fact, not convict, possibly because of that.
What are the chances that you would have found the body of Sykes if Lonnie Thompson had not told you where to look?
The chances of us locating Gerald Sykes without Lonnie telling us would have been very slim. It was in the backyard of a private residence, 6 feet under the ground. The chances of us finding him were very small. It depends on who else they may have told or who they may have told eventually. But at this point, he would have been in that ground for years before we found out about it. The bank fraud case is solid. The killing of a federal witness, we believe the case could be made, but there's always the chance the jury may not agree with us. We put together a strategy that we would proceed with the bank fraud case, get Lonnie put away for a long time. And while he's off the streets, hopefully people saw that he was behind bars. Any threats he could make, hopefully at that point would be idle threats, and we would be able to develop our case. Maybe DNA would change, DNA science would change. And what we initially processed would have a result that would actually link us to someone down the line. So we went ahead, indicted Lonnie Thompson on 5 counts of bank fraud in federal court in Cleveland. Bank fraud is a felony punishable by up to 30 years in prison. As you know, lots of factors are taken into account at sentencing. The idea being that we could convict him in trial of bank fraud, and then at sentencing, we could introduce evidence that we believe that he was involved in a homicide. He may not have committed it, but that he was involved in it and he deserved an upward departure on the actual sentencing. The case went to trial in summer of 2001 up in Cleveland. We were prohibited from bringing in anything referring to Gerald Sykes and his murder. However, we were able to convict Lonnie Thompson on the 5 counts of bank fraud. At the sentencing, we attempted to introduce evidence of the murder. We went all out. We put together a sentencing memo, which showed that Lonnie Thompson was present at that point. However, the sentencing judge said this is a bank fraud case. He sentenced Lonnie Thompson. He gave him a very good sentence of 9 years in prison. However, he would not, at that point, depart upward to as much as 30 years, which is what we were hoping for. But we were able to get him off the street for 9 years. Lonnie Thompson served his time. He was released from prison. Once again, he violated his probation. This time, the state put a case together on him, and he was sentenced to 32 years in prison in state court. The bottom line is he's off the streets forever, and the state of Ohio lists this murder as an open cold case. It's something that could be worked on the local level still, on the federal level, but Lonnie Thompson is off the streets based upon the work of the FBI, the U.S. Secret Service, local police, U.S. Marshal Service, and all our friends in law enforcement.
The 32 years, what was the charge, the local charge that got him the 32 years?
Lonnie Thompson served his time on our bank fraud case. He got out and once again started counterfeiting checks again. He was put away for 1 year, once again, on the probation violation. And then the state utilized his pattern of behavior during that time that he was released from prison and did a check counterfeiting case on him, where they gave him 32 years in state court based upon his history as a career criminal.
Wow. You always hear about people that were present during a homicide being charged with conspiracy. So he's saying that he was there when this person was murdered. He certainly didn't report it to law enforcement. Who was it that he said murdered Gerald Sykes? And was that person ever pursued?
Yes, he did identify another subject. I'm not going to give his name at this point, but we ran down that individual, and it could have been a situation where you had 2 subjects in the courtroom pointing the finger at each other and not enough evidence to tie either one solidly to the homicide. That's the situation that we were left with here.
All right. So that other person was interviewed and you were not able to get him to provide any information about that murder.
That's correct. In the same way that we were able to get Lonnie Thompson violated on his probation, this individual, we were able to do the same thing, working with state authorities and putting together some criminal activity that we could tie to him during that time. Obviously not the homicide, but we were able to put him away for a period of time as well.
Well, that's definitely good to hear. What happened to Daniel Ideen?
Daniel Ideen, as I said before, was extremely cooperative. He testified in trial against Lonnie Thompson. He made a great witness. He was extremely honest, and he received 2 years in prison. He served his time. He was not arrested again. From what I understand, he passed away in his mid-50s.
So this, again, as I said at the beginning, this was really a fascinating case because when you think about counterfeit checks or counterfeit occurrence, you don't think about it being a case of violence and murder. And in this instance, you had two people who ended up dead who were involved in this type of activity.
Sure. It's a type of thing where when you work white collar crime your whole career, this is not really the way that you think things are going to play out. This is an organized crime ring. Rather than trafficking in drugs or arson or extortion or the traditional organized crime offenses that you think, the underlying organized crime offense here is bank fraud. And these organized criminals will do whatever they can to keep themselves out of prison. Later on in my career, I like to tell the new agents when I became a supervisor that you just don't know how people are going to react when they realize that they may go to prison. And white collar criminals may resort to murder just as quickly as hardened criminals. I think the first and only death threat I've ever received in my career was in a healthcare fraud case where a hospital executive, it looked like he was going to have to go to prison. He sat down and told a psychiatrist that if he had to go to prison, he was going to kill me. He was going to kill Tim Gallagher. I was sitting at my desk one day, the phone rang, and it was so-and-so identifying himself as a psychiatrist. He said, "Do you know this guy?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, he said it is going to kill you." And I said, "Well, that's really interesting." I said, "You're a psychiatrist. How can you tell me that?" And he said, "Well, I am ethically bound to tell you that he said he was going to kill you." But this was a healthcare fraud case. So it doesn't matter what type of offense it is. When bad guys know that they're going to go away to prison, you just don't know how they may react. Anything from fleeing all the way up to trying to kill the person who's putting them behind bars.
Yeah, and if you think about it, your common criminal may be used to it. They might even get street cred for going to prison. But your white collar crime guys are scared, a little bit more desperate. So they, in a sense, could, when you talk about safety issues, when you're making an arrest, could even be potentially more dangerous when you try to put handcuffs on.
Absolutely. Great insight. When you have more to lose, they may react that much more violently.
And again, during my career, I didn't see anybody that actually committed a murder, but I certainly used same safety precautions when we made arrests that I did when involved in any type of violent crime and drug arrest.
I wish this case could have ended differently. And I wasn't sure if you were going to read it and say, "Hey, Tim, you weren't able to do the federal murder charge." But it was great the way we all worked together. And cases don't always end the way you want them to. But here we were able to get him off the street for a very long period of time. But it doesn't always go the way that it does on TV.
It is good, though, that you tried. And while you were talking, I kept thinking about Gerald Sykes' mother. At least she was able to find out where her son was. She may not have been able to find justice, but that's why I asked the question of whether you would have found his body if Lonnie Thompson hadn't told you. I hope that you at least know as an investigator that you were able to at least give that mother some type of closure. I think that as an investigator is a lot to be proud of also.
Thank you. Yeah, just keep waiting for that day where someone's going to call me and say, "Hey, we got that piece of evidence and we're going to take Lonnie out of prison and that other guy, we're going to put him on trial." And I had a documentary maker reach out to me about 4 years ago. He got onto this case and was going to try and give it some more publicity. That never went anywhere. As most of us at the FBI and most of us in law enforcement, we have cases that follow us. This case happened 24, 25 years ago, but I still think about it quite a bit. And although we were able to get one of the players off the street, you'd still love to see this resolved in a court of law with a murder conviction.
Thank you for that really interesting case review. Now we're at the part of the interview where I ask my standard question, which is when and why you joined the FBI. And of course, one of my questions also is going to be, you had talked about having financial background before you became an agent. So tell us about your origin story, when and why you joined the FBI.
I grew up in the 1980s in New York. Like a lot of kids who grew up in New York City in that era, they wanted to go work on Wall Street. So I studied accounting and economics at St. Peter's College in Jersey City with an eye towards graduating and going to work across the river in Manhattan on Wall Street. My sophomore year, in furtherance of my long-term plan here, I went down to Washington, D.C. to work as an intern at the Federal Trade Commission. I wanted to work on the group there that had mergers and acquisitions, looking at antitrust and that sort of thing. So as far as potential deal making down the line, I thought this would be a good background. Instead, they put me in a group that was working on consumer protection issues, and that was telemarketing fraud back then. Telemarketing fraud was through the roof at that point. It was a multi-billion dollar industry probably. And I was able to get a look at how this works and how they're going after the bad guys who are fleecing honest, hardworking Americans across the country, many of them who are elderly, right? And I thought, wow, this is great. I can utilize my financial degree in a law enforcement capacity. I got back to campus at St. Peter's that fall, and I met up with an FBI recruiter. And I said, what would I need to do to become an FBI agent? She said, look, continue to study finance, accounting, even go work on Wall Street for a couple of years, develop some financial skills there, and then come back to me when you have 3 to 5 years of experience and apply for the special agent position. When I graduated, I did not go to Wall Street. I just wanted to get into the investigative world. I wanted to jump right into it. So I got a job with the Inspector General's office at NASA in Washington, D.C., just actually outside in Greenbelt, Maryland, where we were working all kinds of financial crimes that were targeting the space program, whether that be stealing intellectual property, bribery, kickbacks, embezzlements, that sort of thing. So I got a position there, went to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia, and I was a special agent of NASA. I was 23 years old. The first case that I got involved theft of intellectual property. And my boss said to me, hey, well, you better talk to the FBI about this. So I went over to the FBI office, which at the time was located in Hyattsville, Maryland. And I was introduced by a supervisor there named Dan Sullivan. Dan looked at what the case was, introduced me to 2 case agents, Kevin Perkins and Kevin Dooley of the Baltimore division, and said, hey, Tim, this is going to be your desk, and pointed to a desk. That was my start in the FBI as a task force officer, getting invited in to work cases with the FBI Baltimore division. We worked together on many exciting cases that had a NASA nexus. The FBI had been in a hiring freeze for a couple of those years, but after 5 years, they lifted the hiring freeze. I went through the process. I got hired as an agent, went to Quantico, and was first office in Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, that's pretty cool. So when you came in, unlike the other new agents, you were already familiar with the way the FBI worked because you were a task force officer.
Yeah, absolutely. I had been through the grand jury. I had sat through midnight to 8 Title III wiretaps on many occasions. I'd been out on surveillance, had done arrests with the FBI office. And yes, I was definitely in a position to hit the ground running, which is probably why I ended up in a 7-agent RA, because I had some experience putting a case together.
The case that we just talked about happened earlier in your career, but your career with places, I don't know if you thought it was going to get at the very beginning, because you ended your career as the special agent in charge of the Newark division. So tell us a little bit about that path that led you to hit up that office.
That was not my goal. When I came into the FBI to become a special agent in charge, I wanted to put cases together, and that's what I enjoyed doing. And I developed a passion for it. I developed a passion for white-collar crime. I went to FBI headquarters after my time in Canton, Ohio, to the Financial Institution Fraud Unit at FBI headquarters, where I worked with the banks on a nationwide scale to help the FBI combat the financial crime problem. From there, I went to Kansas City to become a supervisor. I had a financial crime squad in Kansas City. We also had public corruption and civil rights, great casework, great people out there. I really enjoyed my time. And I did that for 3 years. And then I was promoted to special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office. So I came back east. I was put into the position where I was in charge of intelligence as the FBI was starting to stand up their intelligence program. This was the end of 2007. It became more and more of an intelligence agency. If you ask me, the FBI has always been an intelligence agency, but this was just more formalizing it. And I had the opportunity to become the program manager as the assistant special agent in charge. I was given lots of responsibility. I worked in the cyber division after I moved out of the intelligence assistant special agent in charge role. And I had the Internet Crime Complaint Center, known as the IC3, underneath me, cyber training, cyber outreach. A lot of what we did is cyber facilitated frauds, cyber facilitated crimes. And like every crime involves a computer. I was really comfortable in that role, working with businesses to help lock down their systems and prevent them from becoming victims in the first place. Then I was given a position as special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office, criminal and cyber division for 2.5 years. It was a great place. It was absolutely everything you could think of happens in Washington, D.C., whether it was public corruption. We locked up 2 congressmen while I was there. It was gangs. It was the Washington Navy Yard active shooter where I was on site for. It was absolutely everything that you could imagine. Ultimately, from there, my career ended right where it started in Newark, New Jersey, where I had gone to the FBI office as a St. Peter's College student. As a sophomore, I came back as a special agent in charge. The job came open after a couple of years in the Washington, D.C. office. I always wanted to go back there, and this gave me the opportunity to be in charge of a great division, great people, and I was home.
That's wonderful. So when did you retire, and what are you doing now?
I retired on St. Patrick's Day in 2018. I had hit the 25 years as an agent when you counted my NASA time, and I was eligible to retire. I received an opportunity to go work for a security corporate investigative firm in Manhattan. So I went across the river to work there. I worked for a company known as Nardello & Company, where I am the managing director in charge of digital investigations and cyber defense, and I am also their chief security officer. We go out every day. We work with our clients to lock down their systems, to keep threat actors out, and to assist them with their own litigation. When you're an FBI agent, heard about me working with AUSAs, assistant U.S. attorneys, where you're getting ready to go to trial. The AUSAs, they ask you, hey, have you run this down? Can you obtain this piece of information, everything to make their case tighter? Now we'll get to do that on the private sector side, where companies may be entering into a civil suit. They don't have a whole slew of FBI agents they can reach out for cyber work or for interviewing witnesses, that sort of thing. So they reach out to Nardello & Company, where I am, and I'm able to help them put their case together.
Fantastic. At the end of every interview, I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
First of all, I'd like to thank you once again, Jerry, for having me on the show, but I really want to thank you for all that you do for the FBI. The FBI does great work day in and day out, 24 hours a day that the American public never sees. And your show has given a lot of folks a window into the great people and the great work that the FBI does day in and day out. So thank you, Jerry. The agents and analysts, investigative specialists, and everyone who goes out there to protect the American public, you have a mission unlike any other. I'm proud of the work that you do. Enjoy the work that you do. And thank you for keeping America safe.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find a photo of Tim Gallagher, along with links to news articles about this counterfeit check case. If you enjoyed this case review, there's a link to an episode about stolen gold coins and fake bars of silver you might want to listen to. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.